Chapter 1, Return. A room strewn with torn corpses atop thickly pooled blood. The sole survivor and perpetrator of this carnage, Baek Woo-hyun, put a jet-black cigarette in his mouth. A flame flickering from the lighter's tip dyed the paper's end red. He slowly drew in the smoke, and toxic fumes mixed with all kinds of psychotropic substances, what people called drugs, burrowed into his lungs instead of tar and nicotine. For an ordinary person, just one puff of this smoke would be dangerous enough to threaten their life through acute poisoning. But for him, who could swallow even more terrible poisons without any problem, it was merely cigarette smoke with a slightly stronger flavor. Who? Ashen smoke mixed with his breath shimmered into existence before fading away. Baek Woo-hyun stared at what he had exhaled with murky, clouded eyes. Though he knew full well it was cigarette smoke, it looked like souls screaming as they scattered. The ghosts of those who died by his hand, those he had no choice but to kill, were there. Having finished his cigarette, Baek Woo-hyun trudged across the room. With each step he took, the pools of blood on the floor made splashing sounds. The smell of blood, previously masked by the strong cigarette scent, belatedly pierced his nose, but his expression showed no change. This too was a familiar thing. He opened the tightly closed door and left the room, facing a ponytailed man who had arrived first. Took longer than I expected. The ponytailed man grinned wickedly as he waved his dagger. As if to prove it had just been used, blood dripped steadily from the blade. It wasn't an action meant to threaten Baek Woo-hyun. There was no reason for that. It was merely to boast that he'd been faster. Baek Woo-hyun watched this impassively, then casually threw the cigarette butt on the floor and answered with an indifferent attitude. Had to finish and smoke a cigarette. That damn cigarette. I still don't understand why you smoke those things. They don't have any effect on you anyway. They work on enemies though. True enough. The ponytailed man shrugged at Baek Woo-hyun's words. He recalled enemies who had attacked Baek Woo-hyun in the past, only to collapse vomiting after inhaling the smoke from his cigarettes. Thinking back on that incident, maybe Baek Woo-hyun smoking was actually a strategic method. A method that automatically filtered out idiots not worth dealing with. Well, anyway, this is the last one. The director is inside. Right. Kill him and it's all over. The perfect end of Project Transcendence. Project Transcendence. A mad research project that ground up hundreds, thousands, perhaps even more, people to create a single transcendent. Baek Woo-hyun, the ponytailed man, and the comrades currently fighting elsewhere were all former test subjects of Project Transcendence. Naturally, they hadn't participated of their own volition. Who would voluntarily participate in experiments that repeated acts of zapping them with electricity and injecting all sorts of drugs, all to artificially create powerful ability users? The others had been kidnapped. Baek Woo-hyun's circumstances were slightly different, but he'd similarly become a test subject. Having suddenly become test subjects, Baek Woo-hyun and his comrades survived through the hellish experiments and gained power. Some of them gained power strong enough to be evaluated as approaching the project's goal, a transcendent. Baek Woo-hyun was a prime example. Test subject number 62, Baek Woo-hyun. What the researchers called him, Superhuman. He was Project Transcendence's masterpiece and was said to have come closest to the goal. This meant that among over 1,000 test subjects, only he was evaluated as having come closest to a transcendent existence while remaining in a human body. What was even more remarkable was the fact that he couldn't manifest any supernatural ability. In an experiment trying to create a transcendent through forced awakening and ability enhancement via various experiments, someone who couldn't manifest any supernatural ability had instead approached being a transcendent. It was truly an ironic, almost miraculous result. But rest assured, the researchers who conducted Project Transcendence were now surely cursing that miracle. Because when the long-awaited revenge began, no researcher survived Baek Woo-hyun, who led the charge. Let's go. Right. Kwang. Baek Woo-hyun and the ponytailed man kicked down the tightly closed door and rushed inside. In a room decorated with obviously expensive furniture sat a middle-aged man dressed in a luxury suit. He had been frantically gathering stacks of documents from a safe when he showed a startled expression at the sight of the two who suddenly burst in. He probably didn't even know that the forces guarding outside had been completely annihilated. Unlike Baek Woo-hyun, the man's specialty was killing enemies stealthily and swiftly, so it wasn't entirely incomprehensible. But his confusion was brief. Soon the middle-aged man clenched his teeth and spoke. Why are you doing this? Why are we doing this? Don't tell me you really don't know. Really? The ponytailed man asked back with a giggle. He and the other test subjects had cried out for revenge without a moment's rest from the day they escaped the research facility. To make their purpose and motivation known to the entire world without hiding it. So there was no way the middle-aged man, the project director, didn't know why they were doing this. It would be impossible for someone incompetent enough to truly not know to become director. The ponytailed man knew this well, which is why he was mocking the middle-aged man by asking if he really didn't know. I'm not talking to you, test subject number 81. Huh? Well now. Should I be grateful that the director has memorized even a nobody like Ms. Number? Baek Woo-hyun. The middle-aged man cleanly ignored the man called test subject number 81. His gaze had been fixed solely on Baek Woo-hyun from the start. As if only he and Baek Woo-hyun existed in this room. Biting his lips, he cried out in a desperate voice. You are Project Transcendence's most perfect success. As your nickname states, you are a true superhuman who entered the realm of transcendence in a human body. Now only claiming all the glory remains, so why are you doing this? Why? The middle-aged man's expression showed genuine incomprehension. From his perspective, this was undoubtedly a foolish action no matter how he thought about it. If it had been during the height of the experiments, he might have accepted it as understandable. Project Transcendence's experiments had many vicious elements. In fact, hadn't many test subjects been unable to endure and attempted to escape? As project director, he'd received reports of similar incidents several times, so if Baek Woo-hyun had escaped back then, the middle-aged man would have let it pass as expected. But now? You didn't need to do anything, just by staying still, you would have obtained everything you desired. Project Transcendence had ultimately ended successfully, and several people including Baek Woo-hyun had grasped the transcendent power the research facility had hoped for. Therefore, the research facility, or more precisely, the corporate alliance that operated the research facilities, had intended to gladly welcome them and give them everything they wanted. It was finally the moment to receive compensation for their hardships, and Baek Woo-hyun himself knew this. The research facility had told him several times. And yet he rebelled in such circumstances. Why would he do such a foolish thing? We were going to give Baek Woo-hyun everything he desired. Truly, everything. Whatever it might be. Surprisingly, the middle-aged man's words were truth without any exaggeration. Those who sponsored the research facility would have given Baek Woo-hyun anything, money or otherwise, without hesitation if he had wanted it. They wouldn't have spared any support to help him obtain everything he desired, even mobilizing military force if necessary. Yet Baek Woo-hyun had abandoned all that compensation without any particular reason. Other transcendent candidates had been moved by the overwhelming compensation and abandoned their grudge against the research facility to become allies. What's your reason for overturning everything when only the compensation remained? Please answer me. A reason? Had the earnest appeal gotten through? Baek Woo-hyun, who had maintained silence, muttered quietly for the first time. It was a very calm tone, in contrast to the middle-aged man's passionate outcry. He spoke to the middle-aged man. You won't understand even if I tell you. Still, please tell me. Why on earth did you abandon the promised compensation and team up with those idiots? What compensation did you agree to receive? Baek Woo-hyun looked at the middle-aged man with dead, black eyes. It seemed he hoped there was some grand reason behind his actions. Like being enticed by forces trying to overthrow the corporate alliance. But unfortunately, there was no such thing. The reason he had started revenge with the test subjects was simply to return home. While living here, he had gained the conviction that he could return to his original world by completely ending Project Transcendence, so he did just that. Baek Woo-hyun sighed and enlightened the middle-aged man to reality. To go back home. What? What do you? I learned that I could return home by terminating the project. That's why. What? What kind of nonsense? That's why I told you. You won't understand even if you hear the reason. Even though he'd heard the reason he had asked for, the middle-aged man's expression wasn't pleased at all. His face, which had gone beyond burning red to dying black, vividly revealed how extreme his fury was. He ground his teeth. You expect me to believe that? The middle-aged man thought Baek Woo-hyun was mocking him. If he had only wished it, the corporate alliance that tried to give him massive compensation wouldn't have refused a trivial request like wanting to go home. Yet he destroyed the project and caused massive damage to the corporate alliance just to return home? He. If you don't want to tell me the reason, do as you please. The middle-aged man, who had been glaring at Baek Woo-hyun with bloodshot eyes, suddenly curled up the corners of his mouth. But let me make one thing clear. You have no home to return to. The corporate alliance doesn't leave alone enemies who bare their fangs at them. They destroy everyone, including family and relatives. So what you've done is just foolish wasted effort kicking away your own fortune. Truly laughable. The middle-aged man poured malicious curses at Baek Woo-hyun. They were curses filled with the determination to make him taste the exact same despair he was feeling. However, even hearing that his family and relatives had all met with misfortune, Baek Woo-hyun's complexion didn't change at all. His expression remained consistently impassive, as if listening to someone else's story. Sorry, but those people aren't my family. What did you say? My family isn't in this world. That's why I'm going back to meet them. What kind of nonsense is that? Baek Woo-hyun shook his head at the middle-aged man's bewilderment at his words. As if he knew he wouldn't understand anyway. It had been like this from the moment he first woke up in this world. That's enough now. Waiter! Kwajik! The middle-aged man tried to say something belatedly, but Baek Woo-hyun mercilessly swung his hand. The middle-aged man's head exploded into pieces from the hand swung at a speed an ordinary person couldn't even properly see the trajectory of. It was an anticlimactic end unbefitting someone who had risen to a high position in the corporate alliance at a relatively young age and overseen the massive research project called Project Transcendence. The ponytailed man, who had been silently watching the entire process from the side, chuckled. Killed him cleanly. I was too lazy to do anything more. Is that so? Well, it's your choice, so I'll respect it. It was an implication that if it had been left to him, he would have inflicted terrible suffering. Baek Woo-hyun merely shrugged his shoulders as a substitute for an answer. Special mission, bug fix complete. You have completed all special missions. The promised reward will be issued. Will you return to the original world? Yes, no. Baek Woo-hyun stared at the system message that appeared before him with a sunken gaze. The moment he chose yes, everything would end. He would return to the original world and resume an ordinary daily life like before. A warm and peaceful daily life without killing and being killed. It wasn't that he disliked that. He'd come this far for that very reason. However, as he looked at the system message, one worry passed through his mind. Will I be able to adapt? It was a worry about whether he could return to his former self without incident. Project Transcendence and the life that followed had changed Baek Woo-hyun as a person very greatly. It was natural, having experienced experiments close to torture, bloody battlefields, and even the path to transcendence. Therefore, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say his current self was a completely different person from his past self. An ordinary college student wouldn't be accustomed to killing people or smoking concentrated drug cigarettes. Could he live in peaceful modern times with a warped and broken mind like now? I'll have to manage somehow. Like always. Who? What's wrong? The ponytailed man asked with a puzzled expression at Baek Woo-hyun, who suddenly sighed. I'm going back to the original world now. That nonsense again. The ponytailed man shook his head. His expression showed he didn't believe what Baek Woo-hyun said at all. Well, who would easily believe someone saying they came from another world? They'd just think his mind broke from the experiments. Baek Woo-hyun knew this well, so he didn't bother explaining further. After this moment, they'd never see each other again anyway. Hugh. Baek Woo-hyun smiled bitterly and took out a jet black cigarette from his pocket. This too would now be the last cigarette he smoked here. He took a long drag of the lit cigarette and exhaled, watching the ashen cigarette smoke bloom and disappear into the air. He thought that perhaps he wasn't much different from that smoke. Especially in how he would vanish futilely without leaving anything behind. Take care. Tell the others that too. What? No, wait. You don't mean. Having left a one-sided farewell, Baek Woo-hyun chose yes, without hesitation. Immediately, a bright light that made it hard to keep one's eyes open poured out from the system window, and everything around melted away and disappeared into it. From the ponytailed man standing right beside him to the luxurious furniture placed in the room, and even the middle-aged man's corpse lying on the floor having lost his head. And finally, even Baek Woo-hyun himself. Ah. When Baek Woo-hyun opened his eyes again, he was standing alone in a six-pyong room. His gaze swept past the half-open closet, the roughly made bed, and the connection device occupying one corner of the room in turn. His room, which he was seeing for the first time in 10 years, felt paradoxically both unfamiliar and familiar. As if his body, not his mind, remembered it. He naturally sat on the bed, then flopped down completely. He felt like he'd had various thoughts before returning, but right now, none of it mattered. He quietly fell into a deep sleep. Feeling at peace, he couldn't remember how long it had been since he'd last felt. Chapter 2, Dreams and Reality. Baek Woo-hyun, standing in the middle of the laboratory, suddenly tilted his head. Having undergone so many experiments, he couldn't quite remember which number this experiment was. It was probably around the 62nd time. Or maybe the 137th. Well, does it even matter? Soon, Baek Woo-hyun gave up trying to count the number of experiments. It wasn't particularly important anyway. No one wants to know how many times they writhed in agony, and he was no exception. It was around that time when someone called out to him as he stood there blankly. Woo-hyun? When he turned around, there was a woman with a familiar face. A woman with pale complexion and short hair. She looked somewhat haggard, but recognizing who she was wasn't particularly difficult. Because you really are Woo-hyun. She was the first connection Baek Woo-hyun had built in that world. And also, perhaps someone he might have loved. Swa. Shin Swa. Their connection had started in the laboratory. As test subjects died one by one from experiments close to torture, the two tenaciously survived, eventually building enough rapport to even exchange names. At best, it was conversations through the scraps of time left between experiments, so it wasn't very long, but in that place, that had been enough. It's been a while. Baek Woo-hyun smiled faintly at the welcome face. He reached out and gently brushed Shin Swa's hair. Softly, like caressing beautiful porcelain. Exactly the way she had liked before she died. Woo-hyun. It hurts. Shin Swa spoke while looking at Baek Woo-hyun. No, actually, she wasn't looking at him. More precisely, it was closer to her being unable to see anything. After all, nothing could be seen with eyes that were empty holes. Was it during the 214th experiment? Her eyes, which had sparkled beautifully even in pain, had burst open, scattering blood everywhere. Baek Woo-hyun still vividly remembered the scream she let out then. Even the sight of her writhing on the floor as she died. Help me. Woo-hyun. Save me. I don't want to die. A bitter smile spread across Baek Woo-hyun's lips. Before he knew it, many people besides Shin Swa had appeared around him. They were the connections he'd had built in that world. They all looked at him with tears of blood flowing from their empty pupils. Baek Woo-hyun, Cheon Ho-jin, Lee Dae-hyun, Kim Semi, Jong Dae-young. Baek Woo-hyun recalled their names one by one as he looked at their faces. Though they were faces miserably distorted by pain, it wasn't particularly difficult. He had sworn in blood never to forget the connections he'd lost, and had engraved their names entirely into his soul. You, at least, must live. You have to kill those bastards. Kill them. Don't leave a single one alive. Revenge. Terrible revenge. Those who died in agony cried out. Their cries echoed in the pitch-black darkness. As if boiling over with hatred, fury, and despair. Baek Woo-hyun looked at them with murky, clouded eyes. At those who had left him with inescapable, curse-like bonds. Soon the spectres rushed at him with shrieks. And finally, he woke from the dream. Baek Woo-hyun came to his senses and sat up. First, the sight of the room, which felt both familiar and unfamiliar, entered his vision. It was his room. His room in the original world. Ah, right. I came back. Eventually, Baek Woo-hyun recalled that he had returned to the original world last night. And also that, returning to his original body and overwhelmed by the fatigue that poured over him, he had collapsed into sleep without even thinking to do anything. The content of the nightmare-like dream also passed through his mind, but he merely chuckled it off. It wasn't the first time he'd had such a dream anyway. By the way, Baek Woo-hyun quickly checked the head of the bed. It was to find something that should definitely be there. He didn't remember well since it had been almost 10 years, but he would surely have left it somewhere around here. Fortunately, his guess wasn't off, and he easily succeeded in finding the item he'd targeted, a smartphone. Despite the profoundly unfamiliar feeling, having continuously used similar devices in that world, unlocking it through fingerprint recognition was quite natural. May 20th, 2041. Baek Woo-hyun, who had checked the time first, narrowed his eyes. As he remembered, the date he had suddenly been dragged into the game world was May 19, 2041. Considering that he'd collapsed right after returning from there and was only now waking up, it meant that essentially, the time spent in the other world hadn't been applied. He thought it was fortunate. It would have been very bewildering if 10 years had already passed when he'd barely returned. Though the possibility of that was extremely low given that my room was intact. Still, he looked around more to see if anything had changed, but everything else remained the same. His family, his friends, and everything else hadn't changed one bit from what Baek Woo-hyun remembered. It also meant that this place wasn't a fake constructed by a mental type ability user. Generally, a fake world was composed only of his surface consciousness, so if he investigated this much, it would inevitably reveal cracks somewhere. For example, in a way where his family's faces weren't from a reality but people from that world appeared instead. Eventually, Baek Woo-hyun put down the smartphone on the bed and stared blankly into space. Now that he'd returned to the original world he'd so desperately desired, the emotion that filled his heart was ridiculously not joy or elation. Only something that couldn't be clearly identified as any particular emotion, something of unclear identity, pulled there murkily. Why? Why couldn't he be purely happy? He'd returned to the world he'd craved for 10 years, shouldn't he just rejoice? Suddenly, Baek Woo-hyun's eyes fell on a mirror placed in one corner of the room. The person reflected in the mirror was looking at himself with a dry expression, and that face without a single scar felt somehow extremely unfamiliar to him. Like the scenery of the room or the smartphone, no, perhaps even more so. As he stared blankly for a long while at an appearance that was clearly his own yet looked strange. Kartik! The smartphone he'd tossed aside made a sound. On the Cocoa Talk notification that appeared on the darkened screen was written the name Jong Naeon. He immediately recalled who the owner of that name was. A female friend he'd met at university and often hung out with because they got along well. Right, that's how it was. Baek Woo-hyun picked up the smartphone and checked the Cocoa Talk message. Jong Naeon, just asking in case. Jong Naeon, you didn't forget about today's plans, right? Baek Woo-hyun, who saw Jong Naeon's message, narrowed his eyes. Unlike easily recalling who she was, he couldn't remember what the plans were. It was natural since it was a plan from over 10 years ago. So after briefly pondering, rather than forcibly trying to remember plans that wouldn't come to mind, he decided to just ask Jong Naeon directly. Baek Woo-hyun, what plans? Jong Naeon, cat raising its claws in anger emoticon. Jong Naeon, we said we'd have dinner. Jong Naeon, I messaged because I thought you might have forgotten. So there were dinner plans. There was something vaguely emerging beyond the hazy fog created by 10 years of lost memories. It wasn't certain since it was from the distant past, but anyway. Soon Baek Woo-hyun's fingers moved quickly across the smartphone. The sentence "sorry, today will be difficult. Let's meet later" was completed in an instant, and when only the send button remained, his smoothly moving finger hesitated. It was because he'd thought about what he would do if he cancelled the plans now. Hadn't he already confirmed that this place wasn't some fake created by a mental type ability user, but the real reality? With nothing he had to do or wanted to do, all he could do was sit around blankly. In that case, rather, it would be better to go meet Jong Naeon as a way to adapt to the unfamiliar reality. Baek Woo-hyun, who sighed briefly, deleted the entire sentence he'd written. What he sent instead was a very short question. Baek Woo-hyun, what time and where was it? Jong Naeon, you bastard. Jong Naeon, you really forgot everything. Jong Naeon, cat turning its head away with a HMPH emoticon. Jong Naeon, come to Dweejamadang at 7. Baek Woo-hyun, okay. Baek Woo-hyun, who replied briefly, checked the time. The time displayed at the top of the smartphone was 5:10, so roughly 2 hours remained until the appointment time. Calculating the time it would take to wash up lightly and get to the meeting place, it wasn't very generous. However, it was more than enough to check one more thing lastly. It was time to resolve a question he'd set aside for a moment. Reverse planet. Baek Woo-hyun's eye sank murkily. Just as he had been when living in that world. With a rigidly hardened expression, he turned on the hypernet and searched for reverse planet. The results came out as quickly as expected. Well, it had to be that way. Because Reverse Planet was a virtual reality game currently in official service. Moreover, it was even enormously popular, called the nation's god game. It wasn't just Korea's story. It was the same everywhere in the world. Reverse Planet ranked first or in the top ranks of game rankings in every country where it was serviced. That's how popular a game it was. After skimming through the subsequent content, Reverse Planet was indeed the world Beck Woohyun had experienced. Dimensional gates, invaders, war, supernatural abilities, the reverse world, the Otherworld Response Alliance, the Otherworld Management Bureau. All of it was the same as what he had directly seen and heard. As he'd speculated earlier in that world, it was certain that he hadn't dropped into a world with no connection, but had entered and returned from inside Reverse Planet. The developer is Planet Earth. It was a development company that had released only the game Reverse Planet, gaining worldwide recognition thanks to that single game. Beck Woohyun, who entered their homepage, checked the location of the headquarters. San Francisco, USA. The so-called Silicon Valley area. He quietly looked at the headquarters address, then shook his head. Of course, he could go if he wanted to. He had a passport and a decent amount of money. But what would he do by going there? They won't meet with me if I just show up without notice. Even if things went well and he met them, it would be a problem. If I tell them I fell into the world inside the game they made, I'll just be treated like a lunatic. Damn it. Beck Woohyun cursed briefly and threw the smartphone onto the bed. If he calmed down and thought carefully, regardless of whether Planet Earth was related to the fact that he'd fallen into the Reverse Planet world, going there was indeed a foolish thing to do. If they weren't related, he'd be treated like a lunatic and kicked out, and if they were related, who knows what they might do after capturing him there. Besides, what would change by confronting Planet Earth at this point? The connection device placed in one corner of the room entered Beck Woohyun's heavily sunken gaze. The only means to play Reverse Planet. He stared quietly at the connection device with a gaze that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking. Continuously until the sun set and the room was engulfed in pitch-black darkness. Chapter 3, Friends. Beck Woohyun surveyed his surroundings with murky, clouded eyes. Standing alone among the busily passing people, he felt solitary. Like a lone island floating adrift in the vast ocean. He felt this way all the more because he knew the gulf that existed between them and himself. The horrific torture at the research facility, the 10 years rolling across battlefields, and the experience of ultimately reaching transcendence had created a thick wall between him and them that couldn't be crossed. Probably, he would need a long time to naturally blend in among them. A very long time, perhaps close to a lifetime. The frightening part was that even after such long patience, he might not be able to become one of them. Just as a carnivore that had once tasted blood couldn't return to being the herbivore it was before, he too might find it impossible to return to his former ordinary self. Because that was the price he had to pay to survive in that world. Think about it. How many things must have happened for an ordinary college student to become accustomed to killing as an assassin? Just considering the sense of distance between the two words college students and assassin alone was tremendous. Moreover, it wasn't even a normal situation, it had happened in another world where supernatural abilities existed, so returning would be several times more difficult. Originally, a line is easy to cross but hard to turn back from. When will the blood on these hands wash away? Beck Woohyun looked down at his hands. Those hands, which were clearly clean, looked to him as if they were covered in sticky blood. The blood that had stained him from killing so many people beneath the excuse of survival and cries for revenge had died deep into his soul, not his body, and persistently dripped down. Still, even in the reality he'd returned to. Why are you spacing out like that? Ah. When Beck Woohyun, waking from his reverie, turned around, he saw a woman with a somewhat familiar face. It was Jong Naeon, the female friend he was seeing for the first time in 10 years. In her casual outfit of a box tee, jeans, and cap, she was looking at him with her usual mischievous smile. It's nothing. For nothing, you were completely zoned out though? No, more than that, what's with your face? Jong Naeon approached with her mouth open in apparent surprise. She fussed over him, touching both of his cheeks as she spoke. Look how gaunt your face is. The area under your eyes looks dead and black too. And you completely forgot our plans. Did something happen today? What would happen? Nothing happened. At most, he'd suffered through hell in another world and returned? Beck Woohyun smiled bitterly, denying Jong Naeon's question about whether he hadn't slept. It wasn't a lie, he really had slept well. The problem was that fatigue remained because the specters had shrieked in his dreams. Well, if you say so, I guess that's how it is. When Beck Woohyun showed signs of not wanting to talk about this topic anymore, Jong Naeon shrugged. she couldn't keep saying things when he stubbornly denied that he was fine. All right. But if something happens, tell me. Let's go eat for now. Okay. The two moved to Madang, the pork belly restaurant that was their meeting place. It was a shop he vaguely recognized as a place they went often. After taking a seat, Jong Naeon, who had ordered 2 servings of pork belly, naturally asked Baek Woo-hyun, "Will you drink too?" "No, I'm not in the mood for that today." Baek Woo-hyun shook his head. Of course, unlike his excuse, the reason he wasn't drinking wasn't simply due to his mood. Rather, it was more because he didn't know what he might do when drunk. It might be different if it were when he had superhuman power in the other world. Right now, he was in the body of an ordinary, normal college student. If his self-control weakened with alcohol, he didn't know what he might do without realizing it. In the worst case, since there was even a possibility of harming other people, he planned not to touch a single drop of alcohol for the time being. Never until he was truly certain it was okay. That's unusual. You were always singing about wanting to drink. Did I do that? You did. Don't you remember when we went on that trip? You mixed soju and beer at an 8-to-2 ratio and drank it. I don't remember. Well, everyone was wasted then. Thanks to that, we couldn't do anything the next day and just stayed at the accommodation. Jong Naeon patted Baek Woo-hyun's shoulder and laughed. But unfortunately, he couldn't respond in kind. For him, it was something from more than 10 years ago, so it didn't come to mind properly. Something like that happened, that was all the memory he had, so he just silently nodded. After that, the two continued chatting about trivial things while grilling meat. As befitted people who got along well, the conversation never stopped. From college life to what they'd done during vacation, the topics were endless. In the middle of this, Jong Naeon spoke as if she'd just remembered. "Ah, right. Why haven't you said anything about trying it out?" "Trying what out?" "What else? Obviously Reverse Planet. You said you'd at least try up to the tutorial before." Baek Woo-hyun's eyes widened. Come to think of it, that was right. The reason he, who had only enjoyed Coliseum, started Reverse Planet was because of Jong Naeon's recommendation. Since she had so persistently recommended he try it, he decided to just give it a taste. And had ended up crossing over to that world just like that. Right, that's how it was. Strictly speaking, one could say that Baek Woo-hyun had fallen into that world because of Jong Naeon's recommendation. If not for her persistent recommendations that continued over several months, he probably wouldn't have started Reverse Planet. The games he usually enjoyed were types like Coliseum or Psychic Wars, not Reverse Planet. Therefore, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say she was the starting point of everything. Realizing that fact, malice slowly pooled in Baek Woo-hyun's chest. Sticky, thick malice, what could otherwise be called resentment. The creeping emotion wanted to jump out at the person right before his eyes immediately. As if he needed someone to blame for the hell of the past 10 years. However, I did try it. Really? How was it? Baek Woo-hyun didn't vomit the pitch-black filth rising inside him at Jong Naeon. Because he knew. He knew that the 10 years of hell he'd experienced was absolutely not Jong Naeon's fault. How could she have known that starting the game would make him fall into the Reverse Planet world when she recommended it to him? They were both simply unlucky. It was a situation where he could only say that. I saw up to character creation and the intro. What, then you haven't really tried it? Baek Woo-hyun shrugged. No matter what Jong Naeon said, it couldn't be helped. Not doing anything after that wasn't particularly his will. He had planned to at least finish the tutorial as he'd promised her. It was just that he'd entered that world at the same time the intro trailer ended, so he couldn't continue after that. If you just try up to the tutorial, your mind will change. I wonder. Ah, don't be like that and let's play together, Tilda, okay? Let's play together, Tilda. Baek Woo-hyun pushed away Jong Naeon, who was subtly clinging to him, with an impassive expression. I'm busy for the time being, so I can't. Don't lie. You're not busy. I'm busy. Who? Fine. Then until when are you busy? Don't know, Baek Woo-hyun answered briefly and picked up a piece of meat to put in Jong Naeon's mouth. It was an action meant to tell her to shut up. Watching her chew the meat without being able to say anything more, his expression sank gloomily. Jong Naeon didn't know what she was saying. She was essentially telling him to return to hell right now. And to the very hell he'd barely escaped after 10 years at that. Rest assured, anyone who would commit such an act would either be a lunatic who'd half lost their mind or a wreck addicted to hell. Which one am I? Baek Woo-hyun, who leaned back against his chair, smiled bitterly. He thought that perhaps he might be both. To survive in a game that had become reality, an ordinary person had to become anything. Otherwise, why would he feel that this isn't where I should be in the reality he'd barely returned to? TSK, that's too much. You said you'd appear on my broadcast if Reverse Planet was fun. Jong Naeon, who had swallowed the meat, pouted her lips. Baek Woo-hyun chuckled at her complaining tone, but soon understood the content and asked back. Broadcast? You forgot this too. Woo-hyun, you remember that I do personal broadcasts, right? Did I? Thinking carefully, there was a memory that vaguely came to mind. Though he wasn't certain since it was from the distant past, she'd been doing personal broadcasts quite seriously, not just as a simple hobby. A story about how several acquaintances besides Baek Woo-hyun had appeared on Jong Naeon's broadcasts also came to mind afterward. Pay some attention to what your Nuna does. Who's Nuna? At Baek Woo-hyun's disgusted reaction, Jong Naeon laughed heartily. She was quite a cheerful woman. Anyway, you promised to regularly appear on my broadcast once you started Reverse Planet. So you at least have to give it a taste. Baek Woo-hyun tilted his head. It was because he wondered whether his past self was someone who made promises so easily. No matter how much he'd changed, ultimately the foundation should be the same. Moreover, just before it was just appearing on a broadcast once, but now it had become regular appearances. I said that? Really? No, I mean, that's just saying it like that. Well, it might not have been all the way to regular appearances. Jong Naeon grumbled and avoided his gaze. Even in her thinking, regular appearances were a stretch. But that was only for a moment. Clinging to Baek Woo-hyun again, she poked at his sides. Let's play together, Tilda, okay? Let's play together, Tilda? Baek Woo-hyun looked at Jong Naeon whining and acting spoiled with murky eyes. He had nothing particular to say to her, who was acting like a child. However, she seemed to take his gaze a bit differently. With an awkward expression, she picked up a piece of meat to eat and avoided his gaze once more. Isn't it a bit too fierce to stare like that just because I acted cute once? Not particularly. What do you mean not? Just from your eyes, I could totally see what you were thinking. Is that so? I'm not really sure. Shamelessly making excuses. Suddenly, a faint smile spread across Baek Woo-hyun's lips. Having a silly conversation with Jong Naeon, he finally felt the reality of having returned from that place. It was a sensation he could never have felt if he'd just sat blankly alone in his room. I'm glad I didn't cancel the plans. Are you happy teasing me? Who? I'm asking if you're happy. Even while chattering, whispers of "this isn't where I should be" are still echoed in one corner of his mind, but Baek Woo-hyun deliberately ignored it. If the reality he'd barely returned to wasn't where he should be, then where on earth should he be? Right now, right here, this place was his reality. Here, not that hell. And so time passed. Chapter 4, Restart. Baek Woo-hyun spent his days living an ordinary life, as college students on vacation generally do. Occasionally meeting with Jong Naeon or other friends to eat, and doing to his heart's content what he'd so desperately wished for over there, what he wanted to do. It was a very peaceful and leisurely daily life that someone might say was living the good life, just playing around. However, if asked whether this lifestyle made him completely happy, the answer was negative. Though it was clearly the daily life he desired, no matter how much time passed, the whisper in one corner of his mind showed no signs of disappearing. The whisper he'd heard when meeting Jong Naeon, "This isn't where I should be," only grew larger the more he lived life in reality. It was the same no matter who he met or where he went. The sense of disconnect from reality only grew as time passed, and no matter what he did, it wouldn't diminish. To resolve this, Baek Woo-hyun had even considered psychiatric counseling. Just as soldiers who returned from battlefields and suffered from PTSD generally did. Unfortunately, he gave up because he didn't know how to tell his story. In fact, even if he somehow told everything, it was questionable whether the doctor would believe him. Who would easily believe a story that started with entering a game world? Who? Baek Woo-hyun, who let out a murky sigh, leaned back against his chair. He stared ahead with a gloomily sunken expression. Precisely, at the virtual reality connection device placed in one corner of the room. The jet black body still maintained its luster even though it hadn't been opened once recently. I thought I'd never use it again. Since returning to reality, Baek Woo-hyun had never used the connection device even once. It didn't simply mean he hadn't played Reverse Planet. Literally, he hadn't even touched the connection device at all. The reason was naturally because he felt fear that what happened before might repeat. One experience of being dragged into a game world was enough. He'd even been thinking of continuing not to lay a hand on it until he gained certainty that the connection device was safe. Even if that became his entire life. Since he could never know if it was safe until he tested it himself, it was essentially a vow never to use the connection device again. But now, ridiculously, he was seriously contemplating using the connection device. No, beyond simply using the connection device, he was contemplating whether to run Reverse Planet again. As if he was desperate to step foot into the hell he'd barely escaped from. Hugh. Suddenly, a bitter smile spread across Baek Woo-hyun's lips. It was because he recalled the thought he'd had when meeting Jong Nae on the day after returning to reality. At that time, he'd thought that anyone who would return to the hell they'd escaped from would either be a lunatic who'd half lost their mind or a wreck addicted to hell. And that perhaps he, who felt that the reality he'd barely returned to wasn't where he should be, might be both. Looking back, something seemed to have been off right then. I barely escaped after 10 years, yet I'm trying to go back in less than 10 days. It's not even funny, right? Baek Woo-hyun asked those who had appeared in the room at some point and were looking down at him. No answer came back. The connections from the past who had once been with him but had now become specters were merely looking at him as always. With haggardly gaunt faces, shedding tears of blood. They circled around him here as they had over there. As if appearing in dreams wasn't enough, showing themselves even in broad daylight like now. He knew without needing to say what they were demanding of him. Revenge. They would want him to kill all the culprits who had caused them pain and ultimately taken their lives. Therefore, they must want him to connect to Reverse Planet again. But did they know? That even if he connected to Reverse Planet, if he didn't cross over to that world, it would just be a virtual reality game. That even if he killed researchers there and enacted revenge, in the end it would only be fake. Perhaps such facts didn't matter to them at all. The emotion of vengefulness didn't operate that rationally. If they thought that as long as they could release even a bit of the boiling resentment, it didn't matter either way. No. In fact, it was all just excuses. The one who wanted to go back wasn't anyone else but Baek Woo-hyun himself. He was also the one trapped in the contradiction of calling that place hell and viewing it as terrible, yet ultimately thinking that place was where he should be. Baek Woo-hyun, who had been staring at the connection device with half-closed eyes, rose from his seat. In the end, he knew well that there was only one choice he could make. No matter how much he worried, that wouldn't change. Then there was no reason to hesitate needlessly. If he'd made up his mind, he just needed to act on it. Hasn't it always been that way? Here and over there. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Welcome to Reverse Planet. Character creation procedure is currently in progress. Baek Woo-hyun slowly looked around. A room that felt desolate entered his vision, with walls, ceiling, and floor all made of gloomy grey alloy, and the only furniture being a bed and a full-length mirror. It was an extremely familiar room to him. Because it was where he'd first woken up in that world, and the place he'd stayed when not being dragged to experiments. But that wasn't what was important right now. A game, who? The fact that this place right now was merely a game. Only that mattered to Baek Woo-hyun. A game, not reality. Who? Baek Woo-hyun, who clenched and unclenched his fist once, sighed. It was a sigh he'd lost count of. Has the path to cross over to that world been completely blocked? Or had he not crossed over because he hadn't satisfied some condition? Was connecting to Reverse Planet with a connection device even the right condition for crossing over to that world in the first place? Fragments of thoughts that couldn't be organized tore through his mind. It couldn't be helped. How much anguish had there been before connecting again? He'd even been prepared not to return to reality at all this time, yet only an ordinary game had started, so he couldn't help but have many distracting thoughts. For now. But that was only for a moment. Baek Woo-hyun, who had been examining the room, slowly went to stand in front of the full-length mirror. Because only it was faintly glowing in the entirely ashen room. Will you finalize your character's appearance as is? Yes, no. Baek Woo-hyun, who read the system message, checked his appearance in the full-length mirror. Dark circles as dark as his jet-black hair, pale skin in stark contrast, and clouded eyes that occasionally flashed with madness. It was a face that at a glance made one feel this person looked somehow dangerous. It hadn't been like this when he'd first returned to reality. The person in the mirror had been an ordinary college student, and he'd even felt a sense of disconnect because of it. But as time passed, his appearance changed to himself from over there, as if claiming that the body follows the soul. With a bitter smile, he selected yes. Either way, he had no intention of changing his appearance. Please set your combat assistance percentage. Combat assistance percentage, 50%. Asterisk, combat assistance is a system that provides overall help in combat, including posture correction, movement support, and supernatural ability usage correction. The higher the percentage, the greater the help you can receive. Will you finalize it as is? Yes, no. Combat assistance, huh? Since returning to reality, Baek Woo-hyun has conducted fairly in-depth research on Reverse Planet, because he'd speculated that there might be something related to that place there. Unfortunately, there was no connection at all, so he'd given up. Anyway, the combat assistance system was one of the things he'd learned in the process. People clamored that this system was the primary contributor that allowed Reverse Planet to rise to the ranks of a national game. As virtual reality games generally do, there inevitably exists an entry barrier in directly fighting and using supernatural abilities, and the combat assistance system had dramatically lowered this. In fact, it was information that didn't really matter to him. And that remained the same now that he'd restarted the game. It was because he didn't feel the need to be loaded down with something like this when he'd fought just fine over there where there was no combat assistance system. He set the combat assistance percentage to 0, then finalized it. After finishing the rough settings and entering Baek Woo-hyun in response to the request to decide a name, Reverse Planet finally began in earnest. Test subject number 48. A low male voice that echoed through the room. Baek Woo-hyun raised his head and directed his gaze toward where the voice came from. There, a surveillance camera and speaker looking this way were installed. This too was a familiar sight to him. Sickeningly so. The voice, probably the researcher in charge of Baek Woo-hyun, continued speaking without caring what reaction he showed. Since you awakened in the last experiment, it's been a week. So, how do you feel? Is it bearable? They're not showing before awakening after all. Baek Woo-hyun thought while ignoring the researcher's words. Certainly, considering that Reverse Planet was a game, it was a reasonable decision. The experiments before ability manifestation were merely torture. Since they just repeated acts close to torture until awakening, all to create artificial ability users, it would have been difficult to implement as a game. Though for him, who had directly experienced all of that with his own body, it was an ambiguous feeling. You'd better adapt quickly. Otherwise you'll die. Once awakening occurs, the experiment intensity increases. This is advice coming from pure goodwill. Pure goodwill? Ridiculous. Baek Woo-hyun stared at the surveillance camera with coldly flashing eyes. He ridiculed the word goodwill, but he knew very well that the advice itself wasn't false. When he manifested abilities over there too, several other test subjects had died, unable to withstand the suddenly increased experiment intensity. And that had been the same for him as well. Though he'd awakened, having only acquired the first core element using the system, he'd nearly died in the first experiment. If not for the body strengthened by the core element's additional effects, he would have lost his life. Are you listening, test subject number 48? Well, fine. It's your freedom whether to accept the advice or not. I'll also freely start the experiment. Exit the room. Soon, with a clack, the door opened. Baek Woo-hyun obediently followed the researcher's instructions and headed outside. Because he recognized that resisting would be meaningless anyway since everything was just proceeding according to a predetermined storyline. Of course, separate from that, if a situation came where he could kill the researcher, he would act without mercy. Since this was a game, it would only be fake, but even that alone could somewhat appease the clamoring specter's resentment. The place he arrived at after walking straight through the corridor connected to the door was a somewhat larger room. Unlike where he'd originally been, it was just a large room with no furniture placed in it. However, it wasn't entirely empty. In the room stood something humanoid covered in a pure white shell, and seeing it, Baek Woo-hyun's eyes narrowed. Because he recognized the identity of this bizarrely shaped thing at once. Etinel. Etinel. A byproduct that the research facility had obtained while conducting Project Transcendence in the past, and the culprit that had taken the lives of countless test subjects. That damn thing had been nothing less than a grim reaper to the test subjects, including Baek Woo-hyun. After all, it was a weapon designed from the start to kill awakened ability users. It's still an early version. The early version Etinel was merely an object that was just strong and hard. The problem was that it was strong and hard enough to easily subdue most awakeners, but conversely, that meant it had nothing particularly special besides that. Considering that it would become stronger through improvements as time passed, and the final version would even partially handle supernatural abilities permitted only to awakeners, it was still at the toy level for now. Ah, right. I remember. It starts from here. Right after awakening, an Etinel. The two pieces of information combined in his mind and dredged up memories from the distant past. Having realized what would start from now, Baek Woo-hyun's eyes shone pitch black. The same thing as a moment in the past would occur, but the result would certainly, and completely, be different. No one else but he would make it so. The content of this experiment is simple. Fight the Etinel with your manifested supernatural ability. Chapter 5, Supernatural Ability. Kaing. As if responding to the researcher's words, two red lights flashed in the Etinel's head area. It looked like a sleeping killing machine had opened its eyes. In reality, it was merely the main sensor activating as it transitioned to combat mode, but that's how it looked from the outside. Soon, the Etinel captured Baek Woo-hyun, set as the enemy, with its red main sensor. In the chilling atmosphere where combat could begin at any moment. Baek Woo-hyun looked at the Etinel impassively. Without any preparation. It even seemed as if he'd given up on fighting back. However, there was a reason for his attitude. A solid reason based on the experience he'd directly undergone in the past. It should come out soon. Indeed, just as Baek Woo-hyun expected, before the Etinel could even show movement, the surroundings were dyed grey and time stopped. What appeared before him next was the system window he'd seen before. Proceeding with supernatural ability initial settings. Please select your first supernatural ability core element. Asterisk, supernatural ability core elements are characteristics that form the foundation of supernatural abilities. Your supernatural ability will grow based on this element. Reconfiguration is possible at any time. To understand the system message, one first needed to know Reverse Planet's supernatural ability system. Reverse Planet's supernatural ability system was designed to grow by extending branches centered around core elements. For example, if you wanted a supernatural ability to fight with flames, you would first select the core element called Red Ruby Heart that could create flames, then strengthen it with various sub-elements. Then, as you steadily strengthened the core element, an opportunity to select a core element would come again, at which point you would select a different core element according to the supernatural ability's growth direction and strengthen that with sub-elements again. Users usually call the supernatural ability configuration diagram densely composed of core elements and various elements a build. Because not only the quantity of core elements but also the sub-elements were tremendously vast, the value of a well-constructed build in Reverse Planet was considerable. In pro leagues, there were even builders who specialized only in composing builds, and pros builds were guarded with ironclad security. Generally, no matter how well you constructed a build, there were inevitably parts you had to give up, and those parts could usually be exploited as weaknesses. Though that was quite a distant story from Baek Woo-hyun, who had only used supernatural abilities that could be called such, in reality. Here it is. Baek Woo-hyun, who had been scrolling through a list filled with numerous core elements, soon discovered the core element he'd been looking for. The core element that made him grow not into a normal awakener, but into a monster with the title Superhuman, Perfect Being. Core element, Perfect Being. First effect, cannot use supernatural ability skills. Second effect, physical abilities increase very greatly. Additional increase according to level. Third effect, supernatural ability resistance increases very greatly. Additional increase according to level. If they were users who had played Reverse Planet, they would have been bewildered the moment they read the first effect of Perfect Being. All combat in Reverse Planet was based on supernatural ability skills derived from core elements, yet the very first effect flatly stated you couldn't use them, so they couldn't help it. Wasn't it an effect practically close to a penalty? Of course, as compensation for that, it was written that physical abilities and supernatural ability resistance greatly increased. Additionally, that they increased further according to level. It was content about what's called a growth-type effect, but even so, the fact that you had to face enemies using supernatural abilities with your bare body without any supernatural ability didn't change. It meant it was the same as charging at an opponent holding a gun while only trusting your strong body. A core element that no one in their right mind would choose. In reality, among users, perfect being was considered a representative dud element. Because the advantage of increased physical abilities and supernatural ability resistance, even with additional increases according to level, was far too insufficient to erase the huge disadvantage of being unable to use supernatural ability skills. You have selected core element, perfect being. Nevertheless, the reason Baek Woo-hyun chose this was simple. Because the reverse planet he'd experienced was a story in reality, and there was no such thing as combat assistance there. Handling a supernatural ability was like moving a third hand that suddenly appeared at will. Did it seem easy without any help? Of course not. Baek Woo-hyun had seen many awakened test subjects die because they couldn't properly handle their supernatural abilities. So he'd made the decision to give up supernatural abilities entirely. It meant that rather than learning the sense of handling supernatural abilities in a situation where he could die in the very next experiment, he sought survival with strong physical abilities instead. Such a decision ultimately made him a superhuman and led to him being called Project Transcendence's most perfect success. Swish, tart! The moment after stop time began to flow again. The Etinel that had been standing still crouched down low, then kicked off the ground hard and rushed at Baek Woo-hyun. A sudden charge that began without any warning. But Baek Woo-hyun wasn't flustered. Because this too was something he'd already expected. He glared at the Etinel closing the distance with coldly sunken eyes. At some point, his pupils had changed to inverted eyes with the black and white parts reversed. It was proof of the core element, perfect being. As expected, whether there or here. Baek Woo-hyun, who strode forward to meet it, immediately twisted his body. The Etinel's fist, loaded with heavy force, grazed his chest, leaving a paper-thin gap. A precarious dodge that was close enough to feel tingling pain. What he gained as compensation for risking the danger of a direct hit was an opportunity to counterattack. Puok! The Etinel, kicked in the back of the knee, swayed greatly. Baek Woo-hyun's eyes gleamed as he stretched out his right hand and grabbed the Etinel's defenseless exposed neck. In a situation where the surprise attack had missed and even one knee was bent touching the ground, there was nothing the Etinel could do in response. It merely looked up at the Reaper gripping its lifeline with its red glowing main sensor. Kwa Duk. Researchers consistently only do unpleasant things. Baek Woo-hyun tore off the Etinel's neck area. Entirely calmly, with an attitude that this was naturally what should be done. Amid pieces of pure white shell flying up, wires still crackling with electricity and mechanical devices poured down onto the floor with a clatter. The physical abilities strengthened by perfect being far surpassed those of ordinary awakeners, so tearing apart a lump of metal wasn't particularly difficult. Moreover, this was also the limit of the early version Etinel. If it had been upgraded just a few more times, it couldn't have been destroyed with merely this much strength. The combat AI was just as inferior as its basic performance. It was pointlessly honest and slow to respond. To Baek Woo-hyun, who had even faced completed Etinels, the early version Etinel was merely a ridiculous small fry. Not even worth being happy about victory. Keeping. Soon the Etinel, whose main sensor had stopped blinking, collapsed with a thud. It was a perfect victory without a single wound. It was also a completely different result from the past when he'd been beaten nearly to death. Baek Woo-hyun, who threw the mechanical debris he'd been holding in his right hand onto the floor, clenched his fist tight. Was it because it was a sensation he was feeling after quite a while? Or was it because the spectres, whose revenge had been achieved even a little as they'd wished, were rejoicing? A ferocious desire boiled up from deep within his chest. Pure murderous intent to tear everything to death. Who? Baek Woo-hyun exhaled lengthily to suppress it. It wasn't yet time to release the monster inside him. Not yet. Experiment complete. Remarkable. Test subject number 48. Perhaps it was an unexpected result. Deep agitation was mixed in the researcher's voice. Well, it made sense, since a test subject who had just awakened a supernatural ability had torn off the Etinel's neck in one go. Though Baek Woo-hyun treated the early version Etinel as about toy level, originally Etinels were weapons that could easily tear ordinary awakeners to death. They weren't treated as equivalent to Grim Reapers by test subjects for nothing. Since he'd torn apart such an Etinel outright, the researcher couldn't help but be flustered. At this level, it's incomparable even to the supernatural ability aptitude of ordinary test subjects. Ordinary users generally met a very different result from Baek Woo-hyun in this battle. The result of a miserable defeat. It was natural if you thought about it. After character creation, wasn't it a situation where they were thrown straight into combat without any explanation about supernatural abilities? It was practically the same as pushing them from behind to lose. And in fact, that was the actual intention. Even if they'd awakened, it was deliberately set up as a fight with the Etenel to show off that the research facility could easily smash it. Users regarded this as a kind of initiation rite. Good. Then let's start the next experiment. Quagwang. Cutting off the researcher's words, a huge explosion sound suddenly echoed. The explosion was so powerful that even the laboratory where Baek Woo-hyun was standing felt a faint tremor shaking the ground. Immediately after, the red emergency lights installed inside the laboratory began blinking wildly while spitting out sounds saying emergency alert issued. Emergency alert issued. What's happening? The researcher, flustered by the sudden situation, seemed to have forgotten that the microphone was on. Sounds of bustling movement came through the speaker. Along with other researchers' shouts like "It's an intrusion, the government bastards." Baek Woo-hyun, who had been listening quietly, soon realized what had happened. During his suffering caught up in Project Transcendence, the opportunity that would allow him to escape arrived at this very moment. Research facility attack by Otherworld Management Bureau agents. Jijik. You bastards! How did you get here? Why? Noise that seemed to tear the ears and the researcher's terrible scream. And after a brief silence, what came through the speaker was a somehow familiar female voice. This message is for the wronged victims trapped in the research facility. We ask that you come outside with all your might right now. Please somehow join up with us. Quagwang. If you wish to regain your freedom, you must not wait idly. Move, quickly. Right after the woman declared in a resolute tone. Quagwagwagwang. An explosion far more massive than before occurred. For a moment, Baek Woo-hyun felt the ground sink, and soon saw his vision die pitch black. It was a blackout effect commonly used in virtual reality games to express situations where the player lost consciousness. Since they couldn't actually make you lose consciousness during a game, it meant temporarily taking away sight and bodily freedom to make you feel in a similar state. As it was a familiar experience for anyone who had played virtual reality games to some extent, Baek Woo-hyun handled it skillfully. Though even calling it handling, in the end waiting for the blackout effect to end was all there was, anyway. Where? Good, I can move now. Baek Woo-hyun, who realized his senses had returned, quickly rose to his feet. After the vision that had turned pitch black cleared, the first thing that entered his eyes was the sight of the research facility's interior miserably destroyed by the explosion. Not only was it on fire here and there, but the ceiling, floor, and walls were collapsed or cracked everywhere, and from dangling wires, lightning intermittently crackled and sparked. It was an appearance where one could immediately recognize that the research facility had suffered massive damage from the explosion just moments ago. They said to come outside. If it were an ordinary player, they would have worried not knowing where outside it was and somehow searched for the way, but Baek Woo-hyun was different. He knew the research facility's internal geography very well. He'd tried escaping once, gone back to examine it, and even directly destroyed the rebuilt facility, so he couldn't help but know it in detail. The research facility is built underground, so to go outside, I need to go up. Baek Woo-hyun looked around again to find the path going outside. However, he soon realized there was no need for that, because except for one corridor, everything was either blocked with debris or had gaps too large to cross. Since Reverse Planet was a game in the first place, unlike reality, it would have subtly marked the path forward like this. Shall I go? Chapter 6, Revenge. After advancing through the burning research facility for a while, Baek Woo-hyun lowered his body at the presence of someone felt in the distance. It was a ready stance to immediately rush in and tear them apart if they were research facility personnel. Not an enemy. Baek Woo-hyun discovered Etenel debris and a man sitting slumped beside it, then narrowed his eyes. If nothing else, at the very least he could immediately tell the man wasn't research facility personnel. If he were research facility personnel, he couldn't have fought such a battle with the Etenel, which would be on the same side. Who's there? The man, who belatedly heard the sound, raised his hand. Wary Uriok, flames rose above his hand, but they didn't feel very threatening. Because the arm he'd raised trembled, seemingly having sustained considerable injuries fighting the Etenel. Even the flames themselves, despite burning vigorously, swayed precariously as if they'd go out at any moment. Baek Woo-hyun, who had been contemplating whether to ignore him and pass by, soon approached the man. Since this was inside a game, not reality, everything placed had an appropriate reason for it, so it was to confirm him. Moreover, he was confident that with the man's current injuries, even if he were hostile, he could tear him apart in an instant. "You're a victim." Kuek. The man also soon realized that Baek Woo-hyun was a test subject, not a researcher, and lowered his hand. After gasping for breath for a moment, he spoke. "The fact that you came this far means you intend to escape, right?" "Just so happens." Kuliok. "I can help." When the man, who vomited blood with a gush, touched the tablet he had, the door beside him opened. Inside the space beyond the door were numerous weapons. From personal firearms like assault rifles and submachine guns to heavy weapons like grenade launchers and rocket launchers. Cold weapons were no less numerous than firearms. Not only melee weapons like swords, spears, axes, and clubs, but also ranged weapons like bows and crossbows, and even exotic weapons like chain scythes, jamadars, and chakrams. Baek Woo-hyun realized this was one of several armories existing inside the research facility. Probably this man had been assigned the role of sealing this place and preventing research facility personnel from arming themselves during the Otherworld Management Bureau's attack on the research facility. Then he'd encountered the Etinel and fought it, ending up in his current state. "Anything, take your pick freely. And this too." The item the man threw to Baek Woo-hyun was a radio. He muttered in a weakened tone while leaning his back against the wall. "If you don't know what to do after you get outside, at least try talking through that." The man's head drooped after adding, "The Bureau will come get you." His life finally ended due to injuries sustained in the death struggle with the Etinel. It was an appearance of dying to the very end merely as an agent of the Bureau, without leaving behind a single word of last words for himself. Baek Woo-hyun overlaid the dead man with visions of the test subject comrades he'd been with in the past. Those who had absolutely never yielded even before death. That's why, even though he'd obtained a radio he hadn't been able to get in reality, he paid it no attention. After silently looking down at the man for a while, he soon struck the ceiling hard. The ceiling, already weakened by successive explosions, collapsed instantly, and concrete debris that fell down with a crash covered the corpse. Before the simply made grave, specters appeared around Baek Woo-hyun standing alone. As always, they were shedding tears of blood from their haggard eyes. Revenge. Terrible revenge. The specters surrounding Baek Woo-hyun whispered to him. Revenge. The sweetest revenge. Even if it's false, it will be enough to release our indignation. Baek Woo-hyun slowly raised his head. At some point, his eyes had changed to inverted eyes. Murderous intent and madness swirled within the two eyes with black and white reversed. Eventually, that Superhuman took a step forward. "I never thought I'd start this game." Perhaps she was just in her early 20s? A woman with a youthful look still remaining throughout her face muttered as if sighing. She was a woman with an impressive appearance, neat black bob cut short around the nape, somewhat haughty-looking eyes, and a tear mole mark below her left eye. Enough to be called a typical cat-like beauty. Does anyone know why this happened? The woman, who sighed deeply, threw out a question as if someone were beside her. Even though clearly no one was around. If someone who didn't know the situation saw this, they would doubt whether her mind had gone, but that wasn't particularly the case. There were over 1,500 people present here, merely not visible to the eye. The viewers who had come to watch her personal broadcast. Why did this happen? So funny for Rayal. You'd know better than anyone else. It's all karma coming back around Tilda. At the woman's scream that burst out suddenly, the chat window displayed on one side of her vision was plastered with ridicule. Though it was a reaction she'd somewhat expected and induced, actually seeing chats full of ridicule wasn't a pleasant thing. The woman pouted her lips with genuine feeling. For me to play Reverse Planet. A hipster's pride weeps, it weeps. You chose this mainstream game, deal with it. Why is this person reacting like this when starting the nation's god game? Genuinely don't know, you get out. At least she knows she's a hipster. Who threatened with a knife to pick Replar as a penalty? This isn't a penalty I set. You guys arbitrarily decided it. At the woman's outcry that exploded again, the chat window filled once more with. They seemed quite pleased to be able to tease her after a while. Well, if one learned their circumstances, it wasn't incomprehensible. They'd always only suffered from the non-mainstream hipster-pick games the woman brought. After bickering with viewers for a moment like that, the woman soon patted her cheeks repeatedly. It was to come to her senses, realizing the conversation had gone off on a tangent. She couldn't keep doing this forever, so she needed to pull herself together and proceed with the game. Anyway, a promise is a promise. And I, Kang Soil, am a woman who has never once broken a promise with viewers. Bullshit. How many times have you lied about the next game being a really famous game? Her shamelessness is insane. The woman, Kang Soil, subtly turned her head at the viewer's cold reaction. Since it was her own matter, it was a reaction that came from knowing very well how absurd what she'd just spouted was. As one viewer's chat said, was it just a day or two that she'd brought some strange non-mainstream game claiming it was a famous game? Just the game she'd enjoyed during the previous broadcast had been a hipster pick game started with the same method, so there was nothing to say. But that was only for a moment. Ahem. Anyway, starting now, I'll begin tasting Reverse Planet, commonly called Replar, right? Replar tasting as the penalty for failing to turn it on. Whoa! Look at her changing the subject. This will be somewhat controversial, won't it? Kang Soil, controversy of viewer deception. Going down Wigu. Kang Soil, who coughed, changed the topic with her characteristic shameless attitude. It was a shameless attitude of not continuing the conversation disadvantageous to her any further. Naturally, the viewers didn't just watch her deception. Ignoring her as she even clapped her hands, they filled the chat window with the two characters NA and Rak. However, this also didn't last very long, because Kang Soil, who had plastered shamelessness on her face, quickly started the game. Let's see just how godly this god game is. Kia, Replar addicts attain nirvana. What if she falls deep after tasting the god game? Gasp! Absolutely not, if she plays Replar 2, who will do non-mainstream games. Games by developers with Hongdae disease don't really need anyone to play them, do they? Maybe? Thus, what first greeted Kang Soil, who started Reverse Planet, was the intro trailer. The video began with a dimensional gate rippling with blue light opening in the middle of a city and green-skinned monsters pouring out. People screaming and running away, soldiers despairing because firearms didn't work passed by in succession, and what came next were people in ordinary clothing. Though their features were blurred and hard to see clearly, they wore confident smiles and defeated monsters by shooting fire from their hands or releasing wind. The video briefly went dark while showing people cheering as they watched them. But the intro trailer didn't end there. In the video that brightened again, scenes continued of people in white coats bustling about, people trapped in rooms crying out, and a project, Transcendence, written on documents. Aho! Kang Soil, who understood the rough game worldview just from the trailer, nodded. Still, up to here it was no different from other games. Even the hipster pick games she'd played before had intro trailers at least. Is it now? Soon. The big one's coming. The big one's coming. Kang Soil, who had been watching the video without much thought, realized at some point that she was standing in the middle of an alley. Even alone in a dark night with not even the moon risen. The moment she thought, could this be, someone covered her from behind, blocking her vision. She was about to struggle instinctively when she soon realized her body wouldn't move as she willed. And when her vision cleared again, she was inside the room she'd seen in the video earlier. The very room where people had been trapped and crying out. Even the clothes she was wearing had changed to an Ashen prison uniform. What the? What else? You're kidnapped. Welcome, first time in a lab? Lol, this brings back memories. I was totally shocked at first. Kang Haesang donated a 1001. You've been kidnapped. Thank you for the donation, Kang Haesang. That's a famous movie line from the old days, right? Or not? Well, anyway, does it normally start like this? Kang Soil, whose jaw had dropped, asked. The answer was yes. All players start the same way. Scratching her cheek, she thought it was quite a decent production anyway. Because there was no better way to intuitively inform players that they were test subjects forcibly dragged into the project. Though someone she didn't know had at this very moment fallen into reality rather than a game and rolled through hell, that wasn't the case for her. And above all, an experimental intro trailer. As expected, when you have a lot of development budget, you do all sorts of things. Your indie games don't have this stuff, do they? Ah, this is what they call the class of a AAA game. The production is GOAT from the start. Do you feel the difference in power? Even Kang Soil, who prided herself as a hipster, couldn't refute the viewer's mockery this time. because the production connecting from the intro trailer to the actual start was quite excellent to simply deny. The fact that they put this much effort into production that players would see once and move on showed Reverse Planet's prowess. Just because the packaging is amazing doesn't mean the contents are amazing too. Replay's contents are amazing too. It's not the nation's God game for nothing. Mental victory build-up has started. Pathetic, so pathetic. Oh my, mental victory. While bickering with viewers, Kang Soil skillfully proceeded with the game. After creating a new character, the process of setting appearance in front of the full-length mirror, though she didn't actually change anything, continued like flowing water. And when it came to the next process, she instinctively looked at the chat window. Because the moment she read the content, she expected the chat window's reaction. Please set your combat assistance percentage. Combat assistance percentage, 50%. Asterisk, combat assistance is a system that provides overall help in combat, including posture correction, movement support, and supernatural ability usage correction. The higher the percentage, the greater the help you can receive. Will you finalize it as is? Yes, no. Everyone. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0. 0%. Lol, don't tell me you're scared? If you don't assist, I'll make a big decision. As expected, the chat window was in chaos. True to viewers who found teasing Kang Soil the most fun, they were uniformly crying out for 0%, in other words, no assistance. Since chats were going up at a faster speed than any time since starting Reverse Planet, there was no need to say how serious they were. Even viewers who noticed her gaze started spamming. This has to be 0. 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 Clear tutorial with no assist. 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 Scared? 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 Mom, I want to do no assist when I grow up. Mom, I want to do no assist when I grow up. Mom, I want to do no assist when I grow up. Before the madness where persuasion seemed impossible, Kang Soil found herself at a loss for words. It was obvious what would happen if she chose a number other than 0% here. Spam of the two characters at NA and RAK would continue endlessly until the tutorial mission ended, no, until Reverse Planet ended. Of course, she could ignore it if she wanted to. She just wouldn't look at the chat window until it calmed down. But what made her hesitate was the broadcast entertainment value that no assist play could provide. Clear the tutorial mission with no assist, is it possible? If it works, it'll be huge. Kang Soil was proud of her gaming skills. Among hipster-pick games, there were quite a few that demanded high physicality without consideration for players, and she thought she was nearly semi-pro level, having been trained through them. In fact, even viewers acknowledged her physicality if nothing else. Yet it was questionable whether she could clear Reverse Planet's tutorial mission without the help of the combat assistance system. From what she'd researched beforehand, using supernatural abilities without supernatural ability usage correction was said to be like using a suddenly appeared third hand at will. It meant it was that difficult, so she couldn't help but hesitate. Clear it smoothly with assistance? Or show struggling without assistance? Yeah, what no assist? After pondering, Kang Soil soon made a decision. To take some assistance regardless of what viewers said. It was a decision made thinking that viewers who giggled at her suffering at first would eventually urge her to move on if she only attempted the tutorial mission dozens of times. No matter what, no assist. Mission No Assist Tutorial Clear La 150,001 has been created. Is something a broadcaster should try at least once? Yes. I'll go with no assist until tutorial clear. Which is to say, it was too much money to scold about. She changed her words as soon as the mission came in. Didn't she deliberately drag time to get a mission? Kingically godheartical. What do you mean on purpose? What do you take me for to say such things? Kang Soil, who deliberately ignored chats like Money Detector, Spectre of Capitalism, and Decapitalism Ho, set the combat assistance percentage to 0%. She didn't know whether it would work or not, but anyway, shouldn't she at least try challenging for 150,001? After she entered the name, Kang Soil, Reverse Planet finally began in earnest. Test subject number 48. Kang Soil, who naturally ignored the researcher's voice coming from the speaker, smiled broadly and spoke. Then let's proceed quickly with the basic tutorial from now on.